Did you know that the greatest enemy of your goodness may be hiding inside you? Carl Jung teaches us that we all carry a shadow, repressed parts of our psyche that, if ignored, can control our actions in evil and destructive ways. Human life is, by nature, an eternal battle between opposites. Carl Jung described this internal struggle as an inevitable conflict between opposing forces. Day and night, birth and death, joy and suffering, goodness and evil. For him, living means being at the center of this continuous clash, facing the challenge of balancing forces that seem irreconcilable. Jung recognized that this struggle is not about the definitive victory of one side over the other, but about accepting and integrating these dualities as an essential part of the human experience. On this internal battlefield, the I occupies a paradoxical position. We are simultaneously our greatest allies and our greatest enemies. Within each of us there is a dynamic tension, made up of forces that push us towards personal growth and, at the same time, forces that hold us back and resist change. This unstable balance not only reflects our potential for good, but also for evil. It is in the course of this battle that what prevails in us is defined. Our qualities, when we choose to cultivate them, or our weaknesses, when we allow them to take control. Ultimately, these choices shape who we are and the impact we have on the world around us. Many people, however, seem inclined to lose this internal battle, mainly because they avoid recognizing the destructive side of their own nature. Instead of facing up to the flaws and weaknesses that are part of their personality, they resort to psychological defense mechanisms to ignore or deny these aspects. This effort to hide the undesirable parts of themselves pushes them into the unconscious, forming what Carl Jung called the shadow. The shadow represents the repressed aspects of our psyche, emotions, desires, or character traits that we prefer not to admit. And the more we ignore it, the more it grows and influences our actions in an unconscious way. The shadow is a mysterious territory of the psyche which, far from being inert or harmless, exerts a constant influence on us. This repressed side shapes our personality and behavior, often in unexpected or even harmful ways. In everyday life, the shadow can reveal itself in behaviors that range from treating someone unfairly to adopting self-destructive attitudes. And when these actions emerge, instead of facing up to them and taking responsibility, we often resort to an even more elaborate psychological mechanism: projection. Projection occurs when we attribute to another person, or even an entire group, characteristics of our own personality that reside in the unconscious, especially those we prefer not to recognize in ourselves. Sigmund Freud, who introduced and popularized the concept of projection at the end of the 19th century, believed that this mechanism was a way of avoiding the anxiety generated by confronting our own flaws and destructive tendencies. Carl Jung, on the other hand, agreed with Freud about the defensive function of projection, but saw in it something even more profound and essential for psychological development. For Jung, projection not only masks our imperfections, but also acts as a kind of mirror, revealing hidden parts of ourselves through our reactions to others. Think, for example, of someone who always points out the selfishness of others, but often ignores how much they make decisions thinking only of themselves. Or someone who criticizes the authoritarian attitudes of a public figure, but at home imposes rigid and inflexible rules on their children. These projections reflect what the person cannot see in themselves. Thus, confronting and integrating these projections becomes a crucial step towards individuation and self-knowledge. Projection is one of the most common psychic phenomena. Everything that remains unconscious in us tends to be projected onto others, and we end up treating others on the basis of these projections. However, Carl Jung emphasized that projection is not only inevitable, but also necessary for our psychological development. It works like a mirror that reflects the hidden aspects of our psyche, allowing us to start becoming aware of the elements that reside in the unconscious. Once we have projected an unconscious aspect onto the external world, the healthy step is to recognize the subjective origin of this projection, remove it from the other, and integrate it into our consciousness. This movement of withdrawal and integration is fundamental for psychological growth, as it allows us to take responsibility for the parts of ourselves that we previously rejected or denied. Only by withdrawing our projections and recognizing the defects and weaknesses that we previously attributed to others can we begin a process of genuine transformation. This process, however, requires courage, as it involves facing our shadows and imperfections directly. As challenging as it may be, this confrontation is essential if we are to win the battle of inner life. When we refuse to acknowledge our shadow, we give it more power, allowing it to grow and exert greater control over our thoughts and actions. As Robert A. Johnson, an American author and Jung analyst, wrote, "Generally, the first half of life is devoted to the cultural process, gaining one's skills, raising a family, disciplining oneself in 100 different ways. The second half of life is devoted to restoring the wholeness, making holy, of life." If someone tries to achieve a perfection that goes beyond their capabilities, their own shadow becomes something destructive, almost like a demon. Those who hide behind an idealized image of themselves to avoid facing up to their shortcomings end up never asking themselves if this vision of perfection isn't exaggerated. These people often spend their lives looking for culprits to justify their own problems. Often, the target they choose to blame is a close friend or relative. But this decision comes at a high cost. It damages and, in many cases, irreversibly destroys the relationship. However, even if they remove the scapegoat, these people end up realizing that their problems remain exactly the same. This can lead some to look inwards and finally face up to the aspects of their personality that they have avoided so much. However, most don't reflect internally and simply choose a new scapegoat. Over time, it becomes clear that the most convenient scapegoat is not a single person, but an entire group. When this practice happens on a collective level, the impacts can be extremely dangerous for society. Individuals unable to deal with their own shadows become vulnerable to collectivist movements that offer ready-made culprits, be they political opponents, ethnic groups, or different social classes. Projecting our problems onto groups has a powerful appeal for several reasons. Firstly, it avoids the direct damage that projecting onto someone close can cause in our personal relationships. In addition, as we usually have little or no contact with the members of the target group, we don't run the risk of discovering that they don't correspond to the distorted image we've created in our minds. This projection is all the easier because, as groups are made up of individuals with their own flaws and imperfections, it is common for some of their behavior to seem to justify, to some extent, our indignation. As Jung observed, not that these others are entirely without fault, for even the worst projection is at least hung on a hook, perhaps a very small hook, but still a hook offered by the other. Jung warned of the tendency of collectivist movements to rely on this small weakness in their opponents, using it as a justification for projecting almost all the world's ills onto them. When a group is seen as the main cause of a society's problems, it opens the way to legitimize persecution, violence, and, in extreme cases, even the elimination of that group. Faced with the negative impacts this can have, both individually and on a collective scale, it is essential that we make an effort to recognize and integrate our shadows into our consciousness. For example, imagine someone who has always had difficulty accepting their insecurity and ends up being extremely controlling in their relationships. By recognizing that the control comes from a fear of rejection, this person can work to deal with the fear in a healthier way, building more genuine connections. Only by doing this will we be able to identify the true origins of evil in the world. Otherwise, if we continue to ignore the nature of our projections, not only will we suffer on a personal level, but we will also contribute to the escalation of unnecessary conflicts on a global level. Jung went so far as to say that if collective projection were to spread excessively, the inevitable result would be war. For him, the greatest risk to human civilization lay not in the weapons we have created, but in our inability to understand ourselves. It is this lack of awareness and the habit of avoiding confronting our own weaknesses and destructive tendencies that turns an internal battle into an external conflict. As Jung said, modern people ignore what they really are. We have forgotten what it means to be truly human. It is in this context that thinkers like Nietzsche, Freud, and Adler emerge, who mercilessly show us what we really are. We need to face our shadow and recognize it. Otherwise, we will be driven to something as extreme as a world war to finally see the beasts that dwell within us.